One thing that can make storm-driven flooding worse, the king tide.
Yeah, the king tide. It's not just any high tide. It only happens a couple of times a year. Sometimes it just happens once a year. There has to be this astronomical phenomenon that occurs. It's that time of year for the Carolinas and along the Virginia coastline, which means they have a particularly higher damaging threat when storms are moving through this area. I mean, we saw this happen in North Carolina on Monday. They occur during full and new moons. Not just that, though. The moon has to be in perigee. And for astronomy lovers, thank you, Marissa, it's when the moon is closest to the Earth and aligned with the sun. So you have that additional gravitational pull during a full or new moon. We are heading toward the new moon, and we are in perigee right now, or the moon is. The Virginia Institute of Marine Science is one of the country's largest research groups working to learn more about the king tide.
Yeah, assistant professor with the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, J. Derek Loftis, joining us now to tell us more about the research and really the kind of research that you guys are doing there into and on the king tides. And honestly, unless you live near a coast, you probably have no idea how this can impact you and how frequent they are. But let's start with the basics of it, especially how in this instance it did time up with what was PTC8.
Right. So king tides are essentially that, as you described it, a perigean high tide. So they're some of the highest astronomical tides we'll see throughout the year, regardless of whether you have additional rainfall, as brought PTC8 and remnants of Hurricane Francine, kind of affecting the central East Coast today. So oftentimes those king tides can exacerbate other types of weather conditions, but they by themselves can cause coastal flooding.
Yeah, we've seen that, Jay Derek, across a lot of areas. Florida of note, notably in Miami. I mean, all coastlines are vulnerable to the king tide. We're talking West Coast, we're talking East Coast, is that correct? Even the Gulf Coast?
That's right. In fact, conveniently enough, it was low tide when Hurricane Francine made landfall last week, so it significantly dampened what could have been far worse storm surge conditions. But here on the East Coast, thankfully, we're getting a lot of this rain now early this week because it is the highest tides of the year coming this weekend.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, right? It's not just a one-and-done instance. It is going to last through much of the week. When you talk about waiting for some of the water to recede, I know the winds have calmed down a little bit, but as we head into high tide, talking about how long this will likely be a threat for those areas that are still kind of, I think, recovering from yesterday, what is that time window that we have that it would be in place and impactful still?
So a time window varies based on, where, that coastline happens to be. For example, the Gulf Coast, has one high tide and one low tide per day. So you've kind of got a 12-hour period. Here on the East Coast and, of course, on the West Coast as well, we have semi-diurnal tides, meaning we get 2 high tides and 2 low tides per day. So that period of time is different depending on which coast you live on and where you're at. So here you really get about 6 hours or so. It's not a huge amount of time to work with if you're talking about compounding water levels on tides.
It feels, truly that time moves faster along the eastern seaboard. Yes. So maybe that just makes sense. I don't know. For folks living along there, maybe they can relate. You're in Virginia, Jay Derek, and I'm wondering, with your team and the research that has gone on with king tides, there is a general understanding of it, but what's been most unique from your perspective that maybe research has uncovered regarding the king tide? And we can talk specifically about Virginia. I think this only because the Delmarva, we've got coastal flood advisories out today, in part a function of the king tide, but also, yes, this coastal storm. What's been unique about the research?
So what's interesting about these is we're realizing they're happening, what seemingly appears to be more frequent over time in the context of sea level rise. We've noticed as we've been monitoring the king tides since the development of a citizen science project called Catch the King, which I'm one of the founders of. We kind of helped collect a lot of data along coastal areas throughout the U.S. eastern seaboard. A lot of its focus is in Virginia. So we've been mapping, the king tides since 2017 through this program called Catch the King. And we've had over 1,000 volunteers over the years help us collect a lot of data, over 250,000 high water marks during these types of king tide events. And so this year's king tide mapping event that we'll be doing will be covering October 17th through the 20th, which is next month's highest astronomical tide period. And it's really interesting, the data that we've been able to collect, because it provides us additional verification information that we can share with our local communities to help engage them in further planning measures as we prepare to deal with further challenges associated with sea level rise in the context of king tides.
Yeah, I was thinking tides can be very finicky and complicated to forecast, especially when you have a landfalling system of any sort. But how it matches up, and if you are along the coast, you have vulnerable property, you are a fisherman, whatever it may be, it can have a dramatic impact. But very fascinating stuff, and I think those that are linked to it really do try to closely verse themselves with it. I do appreciate, I'm trying to think if you have any more.
Well, with the study that these are happening more frequently, I can't help but think from an astronomical perspective, Jay Derek, that the king tide, if it happens during a new or full moon and when we're in perigee, that happening more frequently, how so? What's been that research?
So in terms of of course, the influence of the sun and the moon, that part's not really changing from gravitational forces affecting our tides. However, the overall, relative sea level is changing and increasing over time. And we've had other weather effects and larger, impacts related to the Gulf Stream that are causing the water levels to rise and stack up during certain times of the year. But of course, we usually see these king tides most pronounced in the fall because that's when a lot of the leaves will fall off the trees and block up storm drain systems. And of course, the vegetation are just less likely to absorb water as they do in the springtime. So most often we see king tides in the spring and the fall, but their effect is not as noticeable in the spring because that's when a lot of vegetation is during its peak growth cycle. So they're absorbing water as much as possible. As you noted earlier in your broadcast, there are some areas that are dealing with significant drought and others that have large amounts of rainfall that are maybe noticing the king tide more in combination with these rainfall events.
Fascinating. Several factors involved with it,
And our coastline is just so valuable. I mean, especially when we see what's happening out of North Carolina, the Outer Banks, and the erosion, the significant erosion there. So something that we'll continue to watch, and a good little lesson in terms of what's going on with those king tides. Assistant Professor with the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, Jay Derek Loftis, thank you for joining us here on Weather Command.